Okay, right, everyone. So welcome now to the after lunch session. So I'm going to talk about prioritization of SCA findings in software dependencies. We're going to talk more about using static reachability analysis for this purpose. So a little bit about myself. So my name is Hejderup. I have for the last, I think around 6-7 years, been working on scaling program analysis techniques to try to solve dependency management problems. So in my previous life, before I started as a member of the technical staff at Endor Labs, I was a PhD researcher at TU Delft, the Netherlands, where I investigated by, for example, building call graphs to study the Rust ecosystem and trying to figure out how to do dependency updates using static analysis. And a little bit like about Endor Labs, so it's a company working in the space of software composition analysis, and some of the techniques that I've been researching on is we have been applying this to try to solve problems in that space. So I always like to sort of start from like a high level point of view, and normally this may be like pretty old news, but this is usually like the news we always get time to time, right? There's always a new CVE, and always the big question is like, you cannot get those CVEs, but then also over time what we're seeing with increased use of open source libraries, but also as we've been seeing a lot of discussions that more and more attacks are happening. And in a security, I mean, in any organization, right, if you have to deal with a lot of these reports, right, it becomes very difficult to start prioritizing which one affects your organization. Do you even use, for example, some of these libraries in general? And so like in the previous one I said, like, how bad is it really? And I think one of the key questions you first have to ask if you're like working around security in any organization is, are we actually using these project systems? Are we using the this library in our projects or systems? Do this new exploit pose any risk to our organization? And then the other question is like, while we identify this, right, what are the short-term or long-term remediation steps, right? Because not every like vulnerability is easy to solve. It might take some planning to do. And then the last question is, of course, how much resources do we need to dedicate to remediate a vulnerability, right? Having like these kind of questions, I think the next step is like, you want to look at what is like out there in the market, what is like the landscape of tooling, right? And then we look at, of course, now a lot of things have changed, but in order to sort of stay up to date with what's going on, let's say like with vulnerabilities, one thing is, of course, have dependency checkers. So one of the things in the early days was, for example, the OWASP dependency checker. Another thing is essentially looking at scanning in the source code. Do we find, let's say, like any traces of using, for example, the vulnerable dependency? Do we find any files of it in, let's say, like our repository? Another thing is using automated dependency updates, and that is more around, let's say, like the step of remediation, where you get alerted directly when there's a vulnerability, and then you can run your test to see whether something is being updated or not, right? And then, of course, like if none of these tools are really working, you have to, in the end, spend a lot of effort trying to figure out what's going on and how to sort it, right? And if you look at traditional methods, like on trying to analyze, what are the kind of dependency problems are, most of it usually happens on package and build manifest. So for example, like on the example here, you would have like your project identifier or package identifier, and then the list of dependencies that is there, right? And then as like the second step, you will try to build a dependency tree of it. And the dependency tree is also a little bit what we're seeing in software bill of materials, where you understand what are exactly all the third-party components that goes into your project or packages. And then in this case, we may have, for example, discovered that there is a vulnerability down here in one package, and maybe another one has like a severe bug. Then we can do, let's say, like the maybe early stage of reachability analysis. In any case, like with a dependency tree, if it's there, it means it's being at least declared and reachable in any case. So we can see that there is a path from this to this, right? And when you have this context, this is usually the information that you have, right? But imagine the scenario if you go and have, let's say like in your organization, 200, let's say like CVs or vulnerabilities you have to deal with. Then the situation gets much more complicated. It's not so easy to handle, right? Yeah, so yeah, a little bit the problem, right? So one thing is like the alert fatigue, right? When you have a lot of findings, you have to deal with it. And I think the other frustrating point is that a lot of these approaches do not have any code analysis, so you don't know exactly how you're using a particular library, whether actually the library is even included in your project or not, could just be declared right. And the third point is that the kind of sort of standing point for this analysis is that they sort of try to treat, declaration as usage, right? But, declaring a dependency doesn't necessarily mean you're actually using it, right? Or you're just using parts of it. So, yeah, this is what I see as the main problems with these approaches. And what I think is really the way forward to go in general is that we should move towards source code analysis, and that's also something that we're seeing more in this landscape in general. So what do I mean with going on, let's say, like to using, static analysis? Well, we start analyzing source code. One way to represent this is to use call graphs, and call graphs are essentially a graph that represents functions, and with the functions, let's say like the call edge, and that's a way to sort of emulate whether you're using something or not. And so instead of, let's say, like having this old representation of the dependency tree, we could have something like this. And here we're able to get a bit more context on what exactly we are using in dependencies. And furthermore, if you go like more deeper into the dependencies, let's say like directed transitive, we could learn exactly which components are being used there as well. And so let's say like if you see in this example here, we might have two CVs. So one, let's say like is on parts JSON, another one is on the compressed here. So another interesting aspect, maybe I didn't model it perfectly, but in some programming languages you can, and I think that's also the case in Java, for example, that as long as you have even the transitive dependencies in your class path, you can directly use it in your project, right? So then you can directly have an edge from the project down to the code in the transitive dependency. And now comes the point, like, okay, so we understand, let's say, like, what we are trying to use, what is being used in the source code. Then the other question is, like, are we really affected by it, right? And that's where, like, this whole reachability analysis comes into the picture. So if we look at the two different vulnerabilities here, so if, let's say, like, we find that parse_JSON is a known vulnerability, we can see directly here that we are actually not really using it in the source code. I think here the edge is not fully visible, but like you see there's an edge here, right? But there's no edge that leads from our application down to it. But on the other hand, this compressed function, right, we find there is a call path to it. So then we treat this that we are indirectly using it, which means like this, let's say, like vulnerability might actually affect our application and basically helps us narrow down and basically prioritize on the ones that we are using. So by doing this, right, we have, let's say, like eliminated half of the, let's say, like vulnerabilities we want to look at and one of the paths. But imagine this when you have around 400 to 500 findings, you can be able to narrow down maybe to 70 and 80 that you need to focus on. And so in my past life, I did a lot of research on this. So I wanted to see essentially comparing, let's say, like using this code-based approach versus using the manifest approach where you look into the dependency tree. So I essentially like studied the craze.io package repository, and I looked at 3 different representations, but I think the two interesting that are focusing here is on the Prezi approach, which is the code-based, and the Trace.io, which is the manifest-based one. And I wanted to count essentially how many direct dependencies are we using, right? So one is the declared, another one is based on usage, right? Using the call graph data. So I found when it came for direct dependencies that the median is very similar. Like essentially, like if we declare a direct dependency, we're also very likely to call it directly, which I think makes a lot of sense in general, right? And yeah, what is the interesting case here? Well, if we, let's say, like do very light code analysis, for example, if you just look at are there, let's say, like any, like direct calls to the dependency, right? Most likely we can easily capture that by doing simple AST analysis. Maybe you don't even need to do call graphs, and in this case it also suggests that maybe you can just do manifest-based analysis, right? But the picture very quickly changes when you start looking into transitive dependencies. And here we find that when you count the number of used dependencies, right, there's a big difference between number of transitive dependencies from your manifest-based representation versus number of that you get called. So here we found, for example, I looked at a snapshot of Craze.io back in February 2020. And I found that on Craze.io using the manifest-based, let's say like on the cargo.log or TOML file, you'll find 17 declared dependencies, but then you will find that the median is around 6 used dependencies, right? Which I find quite interesting in general, because it shows that these two representations do not really approximate each other. And I manually digged into why was this really the case, right? And I found by, let's say, like looking at this example. So if you see here that app is, declared, let's say, like lib1 as a dependency, lib1 declares as a lib2 as its dependency, and then lib2 declares as lib3, right? Using the manifest-based approach, we will say that app has 3 dependencies, right? But if you really look closely at the call paths, we will see that main calls foo, then foo calls bar, bar calls intern, and then bar calls another bar in lib2, right? But then here we say there's no function calls, right? So there's no call from the application from let's say like down to intern, this later call used, right? So if you don't, let's say, like analyze, using the whole context of the dependency tree, right, we will start including a lot of unused codes that we not really use, right? And that was like one of the reasons why we saw that there was a big discrepancy between number of, total transitive dependencies versus the ones that you actually use, right? And this is also what helps reduce a lot of prioritization, because when you have, let's say, like your dependencies, you have also a lot of vulnerabilities in your transitive dependencies as well. And by looking at the code, we can sort of eliminate we can deprioritize those that are not reachable. Yeah, and also like another reason why not, let's say, like do simple AST analysis. There are quite a few reasons for it. If you look into this very simple code example, we have, let's say, like our main method where we create like a new circle, and then we have something called print area circle, and print area takes as a type shape, and shape is essentially an interface, right? If we just do like simple AST approach, we will say like, well, this shape.area, right, is most likely a shape object, right? But we can see that what is being provided is a circle, right, and not exactly a shape. So we need to know what are essentially the different types of implementations. Here are shown, let's say, like circle as one, right? But if you have a major dependency tree, you might have a lot of implementations. Imagine like the Java standard library, and you need to be able to know exactly which of those might be passed to this print area, right? And this is a little bit the reason why you need to do program analysis, because you can take advantage of doing a bit of type propagation. So you know, for example, from your client, what are the known implementation clauses used, and you can basically put those in a track down the dependency, like down your call graph, whether certain types are used or not. Of course, not in all cases, you might not find out, but at least by being able to eliminate what are likely types that are being used, it helps at least to like reduce potential false positives. So another reason why it's important to do also like static analysis and source code analysis, that is to detect cases of phantom dependencies. Because you can find in some cases that if you just rely on building, let's say, like your, let's say, like, I mean, manifest, like your dependency tree, and if you use that for your SBOM, right? If you don't find, for example, you might find in some Python libraries that there is a pip install pandas, right? If you just use your requirements.txt, then you completely miss this. And that's like a very important part of why you need to do this at the source code level, and having that as less like the source of truth in general. Yeah, and then another area that's like was very interesting to me to apply static analysis in general is for remediation, because that's like the next step, right? So I mean, you find out what are like your vulnerable ones. You figure out, okay, I need to like upgrade one version to another one. And I conducted a study to see whether tests are reliable, because we use those for regression testing and to detect whether we have, breaking changes, right? But one of the things that I kind of caught my attention was that the tests that we usually write for our projects, be it open source or other things, usually focus on, let's say, like the application logic, right? But it doesn't guarantee that we have enough coverage or even effective tests for the dependencies we use, right? It could be, of course, like for libraries that we have very tight integration, that we might be able to have pretty good coverage, right? But there are also libraries where, for example, we do not have too much coverage. I mean, one thing is, for example, the log4j library. Of course, we might find execution statements, right, that goes to the library, but we may not be able to test all the relevant functionality around it, right? And so I did like a very simple study where I looked into how much, let's say, like test coverage do we have, and I think I did this on around 500 GitHub projects. So what I did is I looked at number of, let's say, like declared functions, both in the project and dependencies, and I looked at how many of those were actually executed, looking at the direct dependencies and the transitive one. So I found like the median coverage of direct dependencies were about 60%, which means around 40% of the functions that you find declared is not actually covered by tests. So imagine if there are some changes on those functions, right? That will basically go unnoticed in your test suite. And I find even lower for transitive dependencies, but I added like a triangle there because here we use, let's say, like call graphs, and with call graphs you do a bit of over approximation, which means that it will basically, let's say, like report a bit, lower number, but it gives a little bit of an indication that there isn't much coverage over there as well. And like a way to also kind of cover those gaps, right? If we don't have tests, right, we can also make use of call graphs where we basically miss, let's say, like where tests are not covering, right? So the way you can do it, for example, is to have a change detector or diffing, right? So if you know, for example, the functions that are have changed, you can also analyze whether those functions have breaking changes or even to some degree also semantic changes. You can then, similar to vulnerability detection, basically plug in and see whether those functions are reachable in your application. And if you find that there are paths to those change functions, you can, let's say, like basically focus and analyze whether those are breaking changes that impact your application or not. Yeah, so I essentially showed a couple of examples of how static analysis can help. In one way, let's say like better understand how we use dependencies. In another way, also prioritize. I think the main sort of key component that transitive dependencies provide, let's say like benefits, static analysis provide benefits is especially around transitive dependencies, because here we have a lot of dependencies in our application, but it doesn't necessarily translate to that we're using all of them. We use only very specific parts of it, right? And that's something we cannot capture with traditional methods. Another thing is with phantom dependencies. So dependencies that we do not declare in our form.xml, requirements.txt, and in other ways. We might have such kind of calls like pip.install SciP in our code. And then lastly is that we can also take advantage of static analysis to do upgrade impact analysis, where we essentially see what are changed from one version of a library to another, and then we can see whether these, let's say, like have an impact on, let's say, like the code we use or not as a complement to tests, for example. That's more or less like from my presentation. Happy to take any questions. Yes.
Well, I would be interested in the phantom dependencies, for example, in Java. If I load a class through reflection, that would be probably the typical case. How does, or is there any tool that deals with this?
So that's a great question. So like to repeat, so in the case of Java, where you have a lot of reflection, which is, I mean, in static analysis, something very difficult to analyze, you could directly load classes. So I think the question is like, so the answer is like, it depends. So if, for example, you have the class name very easily available in the source code, you can directly infer that this is something that gonna be solved through reflection. But if you don't have this information, let's say like you store this information on a JSON file that you later read, etc., then you're gonna, let's say like, miss this. Yeah. I guess no more question. So if you have any more question, feel free to ask me later.